Who are you? What?
Aloha! Welcome to this week's video. So this week I'm going to be working on something I've wanted to work on for a long time, and that's going to be a warhammer. It's just a European style warhammer. So it has like the hammer section on the front end and then a spike on the back end. Usually these style of warhammers were actually fairly small, a lot thinner. You can see from a lot of these images here. So I'm going to be making a similar style warhammer. So it's not going to be a large, big, fat mallet. It's going to be a thinner piece. And what I decided to do is I'm going to use a piece of antler. So this is a whitetail antler, and that's going to make up the spike on the end, and then the front side is just going to be regular koa wood. So the entire piece is going to be made out of koa, of course. Everything that I make that's made out of koa wood, Hawaiian Koa wood. But this is actually this is a leftover piece that I cut from a piece I made a while ago, so it's just been sitting there. It's really dark grain koa wood, probably from an older tree. A lot of younger trees tend to be lighter grain. You can't tell how old it is by how dark it is, but it's just a common theme with a lot of koa woods. And so I cut off a section of it there to cut out the warhammer main head, and then that remainder of the piece is going to be used for the handle or the haft. I'm not sure what you would call it. So now what I'm doing before I get into actually shaping down the hammer head is I'm going to be fitting in all of the different joints. So I'm going to be using kind of a mortise and tenon joint for both the antler, the spike, and the handle. And so I cut off a section of the antler. I'm going to be using this main body section here. You can see though as I cut through it, I went in towards the center sections of the antler. The center sections are not as strong. It's a little bit more brittle, and it's a lot more porous. And so I'm going to be filling that center section with a really low viscous super glue. I'm going to be using sea glue just so that it fills in all the pores and it kind of solidifies the whole thing. And then obviously I am keeping as much of the exterior bone as I can, and that'll make sure that it just stays very strong, very stout, and it doesn't break when I go to test with it later. And so that's what I'm doing here, is I'm just filling this entire thing with this really low viscous sea glue. So just a super glue, and then I'm going to go ahead and let that sit. And while that's sitting, I'm going to now go and start working on the mortise and tenon joint for where the handle is going to go into the main body of the hammer. So to start this off, I'm going to be using a drill and drilling out a bunch of holes. It's actually pretty common practice. You see a lot of knife makers do this when they're putting in a hidden tang style piece. It just speeds up the amount of time, so you don't have to do the entire thing with a chisel set. And then I come back afterwards and I clean up all the edges with the chisel. I am wanting to make this a very, very, very tight fit. I debated as to whether or not I wanted to wedge. So usually what you would see on actually any type of hammer or club is they'll put wedges on the top, and then that squeezes the wood together and holds the hammer in place. And I thought about putting in wedging up at the top. I wasn't sure. What I ended up deciding to do is I'm just going to make this extremely tight. So it's a very, very, very tight fit. And then I'm going to wood glue the entire thing together once I get to that point. And so that should hold it in pretty tight. And with especially how close the margins are between the handle and the head of the hammer, I'm pretty confident that it's going to be a pretty solid hold. Another thing I could do if I felt like I needed to is I could always put in a cross pin, so like a wooden dowel that goes all the way through, and then that would also hold it in place. It's not a metal hammer, so you're not going to be smashing it against rocks. So I think that should be more than enough. Now that I've got that nice and cut in, I'm going to go ahead and cut in the section here where the spike is going to be inset into the wood. I debated making the entire spike out of wood, and originally I was going to do that. The reason why I decided against it is obviously because as the wood gets thinner, it gets more brittle, and it would have a higher chance of breaking or getting damaged, whereas the antler bone is extremely tough, extremely rigid, and it can go through quite a bit of strain before it's going to get damaged. And so the only thing that I wanted to make sure is that I had a good solid connection joint between the hammerhead and that the spike, just so that when the impact hits, there's plenty of wood around the antler so that it doesn't move anywhere, it doesn't vibrate or break loose. But now that I've got that cut in, I can go ahead and start working on the next section. So I'm going to work on the hammer section first and shaping. I'm using the scoring knife here to start my lines, and I'm going to be widening them with this handheld saw, and then I have another saw with a wider tooth bit that'll widen those sections even further. I'm doing this just to help one, so I can make sure that all 4 sections stay the same size, and primarily so that I can keep track of where everything is at, making sure that it's as deep as I want it to be. Originally, my plan was I was going to have there's going to be 4 spikes on the hammerhead, and I was going to have each one of those spikes where the diamond shape of the spike is perpendicular to the face. So if you're looking at the face of the hammerhead, you'll see the spike comes to a point right with the face. And so that's how I started cutting it originally, which is why you see me putting in those angled edges there with the chisel set. But as I was working on it and cutting away more and more and more, one of the challenges is that this is end wood. And so as I was cutting away with the chisel set, it kept wanting to split, and that's because I'm going at it from against the grain versus pushing against it with the grain, and some of the angles I just couldn't get at to get a good chisel in to go with the grain, and so I wasn't getting a nice clean look on that hammerhead. And so what I decided to do eventually was I just said, forget it, and I'm going to make the diamonds in line with the face. That's what I'm doing here, is I'm just facing off the diamonds. And then what that's going to do is, so if you're looking at the face of the hammerhead, the flat section of the diamond is the same as the flat section of the hammerhead, rather than it being twisted 90 degrees. I think it would have looked a little bit more cool the other way. It just was becoming a real hassle, a real pain to get that to square up and look nice and not have a bunch of chipped out sections, and this worked quite a bit better. What's interesting is you'll notice that it's really dark on the top of the hammerhead where I'm working here. So I did use my sanding disc, and I used the grinder and a few other tools, and I think I burned the wood just a little bit. The funny thing about that is it's actually a common practice for clubs and for things. When you burn wood, you can harden it slightly. And so I think that's what I ended up doing there with the end grain, is I think I did actually burn just a little bit that top layer, which does actually harden the wood, so it's not as soft. Now there's a limit to how much you can harden wood by doing that, and it does have the cost benefit of making it less flexible. But for a hammerhead like this, flexibility really isn't a concern, because I mean, it's made to just smash into things. So now that I have it mostly shaped out, I'm going to be finishing the rest of the shaping with just all hand tools. I'm going to be using the sanding disc and chisel sets and hand sanding, a couple metal files, and this is just to clean it up and kind of true everything up and get it to a final spot. I ended up putting this groove around the section here. The point of the groove was really just to kind of break up the whole design. I felt like it was a little bit too bland. And so I wanted to add just a little bit more character. I am going to be putting in an inlay, and I'm actually kind of excited for the inlay. So the inlay, which you'll get to see this video, is going to be actual tiger shark teeth. And so I'm going to just ever so slightly inlay these tiger shark teeth into both faces of the hammer. I don't want them to go too deep for a couple reasons. One, because the wall of the hammer isn't very thick. I only have about, I think, anywhere between 3/8 to a 1/2 inch thick on both sides of those walls. Now, it won't be that big of an issue once I glue everything together, but until that point, I have to be careful not to go all the way through. And then I do want the teeth to stick out. So when you look at the hammer from above or from the side, you'll see the teeth protruding. I think it'll look really cool to have inset teeth that you can put your finger over and still feel. And so what I'm doing here is just outlining them and then coming back with the Dremel and the chisel and just slowly working away the section underneath where it's going to sit. And then I am going to eventually set them into place. I won't be getting to that in this video. That'll be the last thing, one of the last things that I do before I oil, just because it's an inset versus an inlay. So on an inlay, it goes flush with the wood, so you can sand over the entire thing. So it doesn't necessarily have to be finished when you inlay. It just needs to be close because you're going to be sanding it anyway. When you put in the inset, it's protruding, and so the piece really needs to be finished before you put that in. And so all I'm doing here is I'm getting it ready. I still have work to do on the hammer, but this will at least get it to the point where it'll be where the teeth go is nice and set. I might have to clean up the section here if it gets sanded down at all, but at least I'll be able to keep track of where both of them belong. So this is a super fun piece. I've wanted to make one of these for a really long time. I'm super excited about it. You can see here I'm putting the haft into the hammerhead. This is actually how you're supposed to do it for like axes and stuff like that. You just tap on the back end of the handle and it forces it out. I hope you enjoyed the video. Part 2, I'll be finishing it up and testing with it. It was a ton of fun. And mahalo, and I'll see you next time.